Hey guys, starting today, I'm planning to create a new series on API test automation using REST Assured and some powerful test design techniques. Now, before we go into details about REST Assured, let's have a look at how a typical API design looks like. So in the picture that you're seeing here, we have two swim lanes. The first swim lane is about the logical design model of API, and in the second swim lane, you can see how this logical design will get converted into physical classes. So an API endpoint is typically constructed of three main components. You have an API endpoint which accepts a request, and when this API endpoint is called, it generates a response. So these are like the three typical components of an API endpoint. And the most famous API endpoints are post, put, get, and delete. You also have things like patch and options, etc., etc. But these are like the most commonly used ones. And as you can see, each of these options can get one-to-one mapping with CRUD operations like create, update, read, and delete. Now, in terms of request, a request is typically composed of two parts. A part that normally does not change for an API endpoint, things like headers information about metadata, what kind of input does an API endpoint accept, what kind of response it can accept, what kind of authorization token which is being passed to the API endpoint, and an auth token can basically define what are the rights or scope that this particular user has while calling this particular endpoint, and things about base URI, where this resource is located, things like caching and cookies, etc., etc. And then it has a varying part which, like, depending on what kind of call you're making. So let's say if you're trying to create a new resource or if you're trying to update an existing resource, you also need to provide a request body, which typically is in the form of JSON for REST API calls. Now, if you're making calls for things like update, get, and delete, then you also have to specify which resource do you want to update, get, or delete. And in that case, you also have to provide an ID apart from providing a body or not, which could be the case in a put request. But when you're making a call, let's say for a get or a delete request, you don't even have to provide a request body, and providing an ID is enough. Now, when you provide all the right request parameters and when you call an API endpoint, it typically generates a response. And depending on what kind of call you have made, it can either delete a resource, or it might create a new resource or update an existing resource or get an existing resource. Now, in case of a delete endpoint, it might only generate a response, but not any response body. But in case of, let's say, post, put, or get, apart from a response code, you might also get a JSON response body back, which you might further want to assert, right? So that brings us to the fourth component, which is talking about assertions. So when you have a delete call, you might only want to assert the status code, and that might be enough. But when you have, let's say, post, put, get, patch, etc., you might also want to assert the response body that is being received. So in terms of, like, if I try to map these things to testing entities, when you provide a request body, you might want to provide some valid test data into that body. And in terms of providing base URLs, in terms of providing environment specific information, you might also want to have some test environment specific configuration. Then of course you will call a test, and you will call this endpoint, and depending on what endpoint you call, depending on what scope you call, you might have different kind of test. And once you receive the response, you might want to have classes to basically parse those responses, and you might also want to assert those responses in a way so that you don't have to do code duplication while asserting those entities. Now, in a very quick way, I can show you that all these entities can get mapped into one or more classes. So let's say for having like fixed header information, you can have a class which can provide you fixed headers, which you can then change depending on your API and depending on your test. And then you can have classes for your request body, you can have POJO classes for your response body, you can have API classes for each of the endpoints, which can basically accept the request specifications and which can accept, let's say, a booking body or query parameters or booking ID, depending on what kind of call is being made. And then of course you can have one or more classes for doing assertions, for doing common assertions for things like response codes, etc. And you can have specific classes for asserting response bodies for different API endpoints. So this is like typically how an API design will look like. Now, if I open, let's say, rest assured, what we can see is rest assured provides us a given when then kind of a syntax where it allows you to basically provide the body in the given syntax, and when you make a call on the API endpoint, then it allows you to assert response code. But if you want to assert the response body, you have to provide each and every field for it to be for you to be able to assert. And this looks like a very concise way of writing test if your request and response bodies are not too huge. But if your request and response bodies are huge, which is typically the case in any medium-sized complexity project, because in many real life projects the business logic is not as simple, and thus also your request body and your responses are not as straightforward as it is shown in this particular example. So to summarize, if you have huge requests and huge responses to deal with, and if you try to put all that requests and responses inside your given when then syntax, before you know, you will have very non-readable kind of test. And imagine if you have multiple tests that you want to write for different scenarios. If you have to only rely on this given when then syntax, you'll have a lot of duplication in terms of test data, and you will have a lot of duplication in terms of what you're asserting in your response. And if you have to write integration test, imagine if you have to make multiple API calls, this test will become very non-readable and very non-maintainable because of the amount of code duplication that you will see into these kind of tests. And because of all these reasons, in the beginning I mentioned that our goal is to use rest assured for dealing with all the API endpoints, but we would also rely on some advanced test design techniques to be able to write tests so that you don't have any sort of code duplication going on, which will allow you to have highly maintainable tests because of low code duplication, and it will also allow you to have highly readable test, because then you can separate your test intentions as like method names, and you can hide all the implementation details into the right class where it should be handled. So I think that's it for this brief introduction, and in the next videos we will start creating a project, and we will take it from there. Thank you. See you. Bye bye.